Welcome to Subscription Prescription, the podcast where you get the information you need to scale your subscription program. Hello and welcome to another episode of Subscription Prescription, the podcast where we help you figure out everything related to D2C subscriptions. I'm really excited to be joined today by Joe Siegel, one of the leading retention experts in the D2C space. Okay, so Joe, you and I met with a mutual client and we've had the opportunity to work together. You've had me on your podcast. I know that you've got a lot of background. You've worked with a ton of brands. I would love for you to take a moment to introduce yourself to the audience, let them know a little bit more about your background, what you're up to.
Yeah, man. So yeah, I was just, the way I got into ecom was just, I was a kid in college, basically just a kid with a dream of wanting to sell things online. And it started with like a small drop shipping store selling blue light glasses, got the sweet domain bluelightglass, .co or whatever.
Nice.
And only sold about a few $1,000s worth of product, and basically just went as far as my bank account let me go, which is not a lot. So after that experience, hit up a buddy who's been in the ecom space for a while, and basically just asked if I could shadow him. And he had me start in the warehouse. He had me do customer service. He had me pick up his lattes. So that was fun. And then eventually he just said, "Hey, check out this thing called Klaviyo. We just onboarded this app." And he's like, "I really don't know how to use it, so go figure it out." And spent the next week really just like investing all my time in email and copywriting and design. And that's kind of like, the early scrappy days where I was reading books, reading copy books like every single morning. Probably should get back into that.
It's a skill I don't practice enough either. And I feel you on that one for sure.
Yeah. I mean, you just gotta, I don't know, man, I gotta get back into the grind. But anyway, so yeah, we taught myself basically, email and SMS marketing from scratch. Like I said, just through books and then trial and error. But the brand we were working on was a sleep company. We were selling a curved pillow. The brand was called So We Sleep. And between my buddy, me, and one other, we were the only three basically running the company. Scaled the brand to do $4.5 million in the first year, and allowed me just to really, chase my dreams. That was the start of everything. So after that, I started to do a little bit of freelancing before being put in contact with a guy named Jacob, who was introduced to me actually through Klaviyo. When he reached out to them asking if they knew any email SMS experts, they were kind enough to recommend me. We met up for coffee the next week, and the very next day we started an agency and called it Fluency Firm. It's still live and active and thriving today.
Awesome.
And yeah, worked with a ton of different brands, a lot of in CPG, a lot of celebrities, including like Pharrell's company and Courtney Cox's company, Michelle Pfeiffer's company, and then was eventually poached by the team at Feastables in the early days to come join as head of retention. And yeah, maybe I'm just rambling right now, but
no, that's awesome. I hadn't heard that. I mean, honestly, what I've heard you talk about before, or maybe reading some of your posts online, and yes, reading a post online, everything's abbreviated, but it sounded like you were kind of like you were doing some cool stuff in retention, and then you did Feastables. Like, I didn't realize how much of a launch you had before you got even into Feastables, which is awesome. Because I feel like that's when we connected on X a couple of years ago, is when you were at Feastables, and we had a few little conversations online, and then it was kind of fun to be able to work together at one point. No, that's fantastic. So that's what, like, history. Like, what about now? What are you doing? Are you still running the consultancy? I know you've got podcasts going on. I'd love to hear more about kind of like current projects for you.
Yeah, so I mean, Feastables taught me so much, but ultimately it was time for me to step away. And so I left the company in back in November 2024, and had basically just been quietly building a retention marketing consultancy. I wouldn't call it an agency yet, just because it's really just me. But although I just finally made my first hire, brought in a retention strategist. And what we do for brands is we like to sit like very integrated in the team, sort of as a fractional head of retention. And so what that really means is I'm not going to be building all your emails, and I'm not going to be writing your emails or designing your emails. That either should most likely be done from an agency or from somebody in-house. But we want to come in and sit above, that team and lead the strategy from the, holistic view. Work with people like you on stuff like subscriptions, work with CX, and cover a lot of different bases in the retention world. So that's taking up most of the day, most of my day's work. And then also doing podcasting with the Boring Ecom podcast, which you mentioned. We brought you on in our last season, which was a ton of fun. So yeah, man, that's kind of what I got going on.
No, that's really cool. And I know that it's difficult, like to manage that, like when you're sitting there kind of touching so many different pieces, but not necessarily like full time with the brand. And I'm curious, like, well, let's dive into retention, because I think that's kind of like ultimately where I want to go. And like obviously, like retention and subscriptions go so really closely hand in hand. But from like your perspective, like what is some of that approach or some of that strategy? Like what are, I mean, we could start with like mistakes you're seeing or opportunities, but I'm really curious about, or is there a retention methodology according to Joe that you're applying? And I'd love to hear your thoughts kind of like from there to start.
Yeah, man, let's do it. So so let's just start by saying this. Like, not all brands are equal. Not all brands will have good retention. And there are some people out there who will sell you on fixing your retention when there's all reality no shot of doing that, or no shot of really getting it to be best in class. So I think what let's talk about actually like what you need to have in place to actually have a thriving retention program. I think the first thing is a strong product.
Right.
And when I say that, I don't just mean like, everybody thinks their product's good. And I'm not here to say it's not. They're not. But when I say a good product, I mean like, what are your unmoderated average reviews look like? For brands at scale, getting thousands of reviews. If you don't moderate them, if you go into Okendo, if you go into Junip, it'll show you your average star rating for your either all of your products, whatever it is. If it's not at least a 4.5, then you probably have some kind of issue.
Hmm.
I've seen a ton of brands sit, 4.0 or under 4.0, and they have to moderate all the reviews to make it look like it's much better. But you really get exposed on Amazon. Amazon's where it's all going to come out. And that, of course, shows you that the product is not, most likely not delivering on the promise, or just not as good as it needs to be, right? For people to continue repurchasing it.
Do you think that's sometimes like a misalignment on expectation? Like people, like brands are over promising how good something
Yes,
is. Okay. Or I was going to say, or
absolutely.
is it something else? Yeah.
Yeah, man. Like, dude, I mean, I've seen, I'm not going to call out anybody, right? But I've seen ads of like products promising to clear up somebody's, acne within a week or two. I
Right.
mean, I'm not sure of any miracle product that does that, other than like a drugstore product. So, it's stuff like that. I think being super aggressive in your ads, of course, can help possibly drive down CAC, bring in the sale quicker than, maybe, on the average. But where that actually ends up kind of biting you in the ass, or biting you in the butt, I don't know if you blurt that out,
No, it's
is on
fine.
the retention side, right?
Right.
So yeah, it definitely matters.
Okay. All right. So yeah, starting with like understanding like the product is number one. Like what
Yep.
are some of the other key components? And I do want to circle back to that retention question about some brands just can't fix it, but we can say
Yeah.
that for a little bit because I'm curious to see what you think differentiates who can fix it or not. But so product obviously, and we've talked about that a ton on the subscription side, right? Like I think on subscriber retention, you can't really fix a bad product. Like no amount of marketing in the world is going to get somebody to take something again if they don't think it's going to work or be good for them. So what else
Correct.
after, from a fundamental standpoint, does a brand need after a strong product?
So I like to look at their unit economics, and then I would feed the unit economics into a payback model that I build. And what you'll see is essentially, if you, first of all, to have strong margins fully influences your ability to have a strong retention program, because, on the first order, that's 100%, somewhat 100% like of what you're going to get on a contribution margin minus, the COGS and discounts and all that. But every order after, there's a retention curve, right? So the first month, there's 100% when you look at it, let's say out of 12 months. The next month, if you're lucky, if you don't have subscriptions, maybe it's going to be 10%, maybe 20%. That's decent, I think, for a starting point. But then if you have to look at it from a numbers perspective, that's now only 20% of the contribution margin you get on an average order per customer with that rate. So it's no longer 100%. So if you don't have strong margins, then your ability to actually close that payback period and close that window is now going to take a lot longer, because your average contribution margin per customer for every order after order number one is only just going to go down, right?
Right.
So that's why I
Right.
say margins really, really matters. And brands that overspend on maybe free gifts or on packaging, or their core product is too expensive. Those are the type of things I look at that say maybe they're just not fit to to have a really strong retention program.
So Jersey, so you're kind of making the point of like, because of the cost of acquisition essentially, and yes, the landed cost and some of the other things that they're spending money on to make, like as part of the product. Like if you don't have a good market, because I normally would have heard it explained maybe the other way, right? Like, oh, you improve your payback period to make more money, to boost margin. But you're saying the opposite of that, in the sense of like, if you don't have healthy margins, then the idea that you're expecting your retention program to make up that for you is maybe not like a good idea. You need healthy margins for retention to be able to work.
I'm going to pull up a sheet.
We do have people listening, so we'll talk a little bit out loud. So we're seeing the customer payment, like that's what they're paying for: COGS, fulfillment fees, merchant account fees. We're seeing gross margin, and then there's a CAC number. So we're looking at we're looking at like month over month. We're looking at essentially like what the COGS are per order, what people are collecting, and we're getting basically a gross margin like by order month. And for the most part, after month one, it's essentially like settles into the same number every month, which is I think everybody would expect. But then you have this Shopify retention curve, which is going like, okay, so order 0, first order, that's the 100%. And then you're basically saying you're only going to collect 25% of this order value month over month. Goes down to 15, 12, 10, 8, 6. And then we're looking at essentially basically like looking at a running total of contribution margin. Okay.
So that's exactly what I was saying, right? So first order, you could see with 100%, retention curve, because it has to start at 100% month 0, you're going to get the most like revenue per customer, right? In this case, the maximum that it could be in this model is $73 per customer. I don't know why it's saying 110 there. That's not accurate. Or I guess that's the gross margin. But you could see in the second month, after only 25% retention, that number drops. The adjusted revenue per customer goes from 110 in the first month, which is the maximum it can be at 100%, to $23. That's because not 100% of your orders or customers are reaching your second order. So that's kind of what I meant, is without having good margins here, it's just going to be much harder, right? It's going to be much harder for you to recoup your dollar spent on acquisition.
Yeah, on this model, like when is the break even point? Like
that's why I wanted to adjust the numbers, because you're probably not going. So, and just for anybody listening, the way I like to look at payback models, I mean, realistically, for most brands, the two inputs that they can influence or impact the most to change their numbers are their CAC or their retention curve. So if I were to lower the CAC in this example, it's $150, and that's probably why they're basically never going to be profitable, because their average order value is 110, right?
Right. Okay.
Let's say that's lower, that would help. But on the retention side, if you increase your second month from 25 to 35, that would also influence your payback period.
Yeah, that's like an average of like $10 per customer. Okay. Yeah, so, all right. Exactly. So we've got product, got like how we're looking at margins so that the retention can actually become like profitable. I would assume then that there's some element of like without also good margins on the retention side, because I think a lot of people just say, oh, well, the biggest cost is the CAC up front. Once I quote unquote have somebody, it's free to market to them, which isn't really that true, right? Because there are costs associated with that. But then there's also discounting that's happening, right? You're getting somebody to try to come back. There's some kind of incentive, and that gives away margin too.
Correct. Absolutely right. It's just easier. So I think it's interesting. Like we've talked about this before. A lot of brands are very open, of course, to like discounting on the first order, but then second order, maybe not so much. And I think that logic makes sense up until a certain point when, in that customer's buying journey, every customer has sort of a lapse point, or every brand has an average lapse point for their customers. Maybe that's 30 days, maybe it's 90 days. I think it's valid to not push discounts in front of those customers for 80 to 90% of that period before reaching that lapse point, right? And then once they're approaching that point, that's when you want to be really aggressive. Maybe then you start throwing out the discounts, because once they've reached that lapse point, their odds of repurchasing the odds are no longer in your favor. Right.
So, how do you find a lapse point or define a lapse point? Is that just like average days to repurchase, or and it's anybody on the other side of the average, or is it like, I'm thinking of like a bell curve. It's like, 90% of that time frame or something. How do you think of or define a lapse point?
That's how I would define it. It's basically your average time between orders. So, most brands, like I said, you're typically going to have like a shorter period, because that's the window of time that makes the most sense for customers to reorder. And then after a customer goes 90 days without, placing an order, you you most likely have just lost their mind share, right? But yeah, that's basically how I look at it.
Okay. So I'm curious, like, what are, from your perspective, like when you're looking at accounts or working with clients, where do you see some of the biggest opportunities for retention? Like in general, is there like a tactic? Is there a methodology or just a mindset shift that needs to happen? But what's a good way to unlock like better revenue or better retention? I should say better revenue on retention for a D2C brand.
Sure. So I think there's a few things. I think if you were to look at, like in Shopify or Lifetime Lead, just like, an overview of like your cohorts in the world of retention, like small wins are sometimes very big wins. Like they can really add up. So if you can increase like a cohort's LTV by $5 or $10, and then you can continue that LTV increase for every cohort afterwards, that can have a really sizable impact on the business. A test that we've run in the past is we added a free gift that was unannounced. So people did not know they were going to get this on their first order. But the gift was a sample of another category product that they were selling. I'm going to try to keep the brand and everything anonymous here. But basically it was a supplemental product added to the order in the size of sort of like a trial pack, right?
Okay.
And that only helped influence the core product's performance.
Okay, so we're talking about a supplement product that made the core product more effective. And so it made sense, it sounds like, to as a gift because enhance that. But then I'm assuming some of what you're going to talk about is like what happens when we start introducing that trial product to people as well.
Exactly. So let's just say this brand is a CPG brand, and it's a consumable product, right? Let's just say in looking at your data and looking at your cancellation data specifically, one of the top reasons for cancellation is poor taste. That can be very common in many different brands in this space. So let's say you come out with a product, or you already have a product in your collection that you can just throw into orders for free that can be used with the core product that the customer was purchasing, again, positioned as a full free gift. And that, of course, helps the taste, the texture, and everything for the core product. If you can address that concern before it is concern, well, now you can actually lead to, you can actually have better retention just from that. And that's exactly what we saw, right? People were not canceling their subscriptions as frequently, and that cancellation reason also started to drop. So it was basically like a full funnel win, but we saw it come through on the LTV side, looking at that specific monthly cohort, which was like, a $5-ish increase in LTV. But like I said, over time, if you continue to stack new monthly cohorts on that, it really adds up.
No, that's amazing. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm like, forgive me for putting words in your mouth here, but then it's like, depending on where you're looking at in the customer experience, there's so many different touch points and so many emails already happening. If we can start to just make small changes that have a strong effect to the total program, it's going to influence all the cohorts after the fact, not just the cohort that you're in, which makes tons of sense.
Assuming it's a winner, correct? Assuming
it's a winner. Right. I'm curious, are there any other things? So making those small changes, finding that little bit of lift in LTV across the board, is that like a lot of what you're doing, or what are some other places that you look for or opportunities you see in making improvements on retention?
So I think another thing is, I guess I'm just thinking about it in terms of like subscription programs, because that's just kind of something that I've been working very deeply in, of course, alongside you. And you know this better than I do probably, but subscription programs are basically, they compound, right? And the more that you can optimize the upfront part of the program, as in month 1 and month 2, then in theory, the higher retention you'll have in month 3 and month 4 and month 5 and month 6, right? Yes. Because month 6, if you start month 2, let's say at a 50% retention, it can only go down from there. So
hit the nail on the head.
Yeah. So that's basically like where I like to focus. And that goes for almost really any brand that has subscription. And so how do you do it? Of course, there's no one answer fits all here, but, free gifting, of course. But I think a lot of brands, like I said, or I don't know if I said this before, but I think a lot of brands only really think through their acquisition offer, but they don't think through their retention offer as much. Right. Like they think once we get them in the subscription, then they're good, then they're set. They're on autopilot, they're on rebills, but most likely that customer is not getting the same level of discounts. You're going to have to make up for it elsewhere. Maybe you're not increasing the price as much, right? Maybe the discount's not, it's still somewhat applied, but it's not so much of a drop off. Maybe they're you're adding, like I said, an unannounced free gift on their first rebill. Maybe you're applying credits. Those things help. And then also beefing up the subscription portal, which is something that you know very well, of course can help of getting people into like a quarterly subscription.
No,
So
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's why what often like, and we will often, I'll take it one step further. It's like, month one retention, or can we get better at converting subscribers in the first place? Because then there's more people to play with. And yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I agree with you. I don't see a ton of brands that have a cohesive like retention strategy, right? Like they might have like a rule in place that they never discount more than this amount or something like that to protect margin, but it's not like, hey, we want to make sure people see this on this first set of emails or this first order. We want to make sure they see this on the second order, the second set of emails, because every touch point, as you said, is like it's an opportunity to keep people or lose people.
Right.
I'm curious. Go ahead.
I'll just keep going. I have another thought
please
here.
do.
So this is a principle that applies mostly to more established companies that have, a sizable customer base. Let's say at least 100,000 customers. Most brands in that category, assuming again, like the product's good, right? Like that has to be number one. Will have it may not be a big list in relation or in proportion to the rest of their list, but they will have a decent number of high LTV or VIP customers. And a lot of brands, of course, people throw around the word, oh, like take care of your VIPs and this and that.
Right.
But in all reality, most brands really forget to take care of those customers.
VIPs is the newsletter list.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so what I found is almost every brand could do this probably today. Like you could go pull a list in Klaviyo of, your top LTV customers, and then add the filter that they haven't purchased within, sort of like the average time frame or average period of when customers purchase. So if you have a brand that typically sells, product to customers on like a monthly basis, or, maybe bi-monthly, I guess at worst quarterly, if a customer has gone longer than, let's say, 3 months and they're a high LTV customer, then you're honestly just probably sitting on revenue because you're not actively staying in front of those customers. So put together a list like that and write an email that's straight up from the founder. Literally get your founder to write this email as if you're talking to your best customer and send this out to them and manage the replies. Like you should want people to reply to this. Get your CS team involved. Like this is a full funnel thing. And I just feel like so many brands neglect this.
I really, really like that idea. And I haven't heard it framed that way before, especially around like the time, like how long it's been since they purchased. And that's something we try to think about in subscriptions, right? It's like, how do you treat your best customer? And are you marketing to them differently? Because they care, they're already invested, they already love your product, they're already spending money with you. Come up with something nice, genuine, creative, a good offer to get them to come back. No, it makes a ton of sense. Okay, I'm curious. I as a kind of like a wrap up question, something that we talk about on the show a lot, and I'm springing this one on you a little bit, but so I'll spend enough time explaining it to you. Is where do you see like, because from when we see a lot of brands that seem like they offload too much of retention to just the email agency, where they're not necessarily owning strategy, or will sometimes like work with a pretty established brand and the head of retention is actually someone very, very junior. And so like they don't know anything about subscriptions, for example, which is why they usually talk to us or hire us. What do you see, like, what's your perspective or opinion on the fact that like a lot of revenue for a business is made up on the retention side, and yet it seems like either the resources or the focus or the strategy is all on the acquisition side, and there's a lack of, and again, I'm overgeneralizing here, not every brand is the same, but a lack of either leadership and experience, resources, headcount, can be a number of those things. Like, where do you see that happening? And then the follow-up question is what advice would you give to a brand that's trying to fight that uphill battle of trying to get a little bit more attention or focus or resources?
Yeah, it's a good question. Something that I basically walked into when I joined Feastables, it was, they had an agency, they fired the agency, or we fired the agency when I came in. It was a fully blank slate. It was just me. I had to hire a team of designers. I brought in 2 designers. I was writing all the copy myself, doing all the strategy, building all the emails, pulling stuff out of Figma into Klaviyo. And in an ideal world, a head of retention is not doing that, right? I guess I feel like the short answer is it's just due to like budgeting and resources that, you can get quite a lot out of, maybe just a few people on the retention team.
Hmm.
Assuming you have that one sort of individual that can do, let's say like can do everything maybe outside of design, you can get a lot out of that. But I think where that starts to break down is that person is so in the weeds on the day to day and the implementation side of things that it actually doesn't allow them to think creatively or think broader term or bigger
Right.
term or expand into those other channels like subscriptions or, I guess like throw around loyalty or referrals or whatever else it
Well, even
is.
just even that VIP tactic you mentioned, which again
They're
I
not going to
think
think
is
of that.
fantastic. Like they're
They're
not
not
going
going
to
to think
think
about
about that. They're not going to come up the bandwidth to do that. It's like
it. No.
I've still got to get the campaigns out for this week that need to be done.
Yeah, that's exactly
No,
right.
so yeah, so it is like really important to get somebody who's leading the strategy on the retention side to get them out of the weeds so they can think bigger picture, be more creative, attack some of the other weaknesses in the retention program. So do you have like advice on how to do that? Is it a question of like, building out the right SOPs, right? Is it building out like is it hiring? Like you and I both work with brands across the spectrum, but say like you're in the 10, 15, $20 million revenue range, like you're growing, you're crushing, but you're still resource constrained and still trying to figure out crack CAC and payback periods and all that stuff. So what's the advice? Is it hiring somebody fractional? I mean, I'm not intentionally trying to set you up for being hire Joe as being the answer, but like what is the answer? Because I've worked with brands where they have fractional heads of retention that lead strategy like you do, others where they've tried to increase headcount. But yeah, everybody's trying to scramble to figure out how do we get the most out of retention. So what's like maybe your very abbreviated view on that, because we could probably have talked about that the entire podcast.
Yeah, no, it's a phenomenal question. And in all honesty, that's why I set out to do like a fractional retention. First consultancy, it may turn into an agency because I feel that there is a massive gap in the market right now where, like I said, most companies are structured to have this one person sort of doing almost everything. And I've seen it literally time and time and time again. I've gone into that trap myself of being in that position. And it's impossible to think long term, big term, everything. And so that's why I started my agency. But I think brands could start to look at, their sort of retention infrastructure maybe a little differently, where, you could just have a campaign manager that manages all the campaigns, schedules everything, manages the calendar, comes up with the campaign ideas. Those things are all tied to like email. And I just think that is best suited for somebody that is like an email marketer and that's kind of it. The head of retention should sit on top of that person. So
Mm,
ideally, I mean, brands can, we both worked with brands that, have brought on really incredible talent, from overseas in Latin America. You can afford to bring in, you should be able to afford to bring in, a designer, a copywriter. You can probably get away with using, part-time copywriter now that, AI is so advanced with this.
right.
But then just having that campaign manager and that's your core like email team. And then you should have this one person that sits on top of them, manages the overall strategy. And for any
Because they can
brand,
get into loyalty, subscriptions, like they
exactly,
can get into everything else.
exactly.
No, that makes a ton of sense. That makes a ton of sense. And I do know like too many of the retention managers and directors that I've worked with, they are still getting pulled into campaigns and creating campaigns. And that's just a huge, huge time suck. And I think of like as a founder myself, it's like, okay, I'm always thinking about how do I get myself out of the weeds so I can keep working on big picture stuff because that's what's going to make the money. And I
Right.
think that it's interesting. I guess I've never thought of that way of thinking about how you can do that for your best people that are on your team so they can go farther with what you're giving
Mm-hmm.
them.
Yeah. I mean, the
Cool.
program rule, I don't want to say it's maybe a little generalized, but I feel that it only really go as far as the most strategic and creative person on the team. Like if you just have the day-to-day campaign people, then you're just kind of going to be meeting status quo. You really do need like the head of the snake there. So I'd advise anybody out there to either hire that person into, internally or find somebody fractional because that's how you're really going to get the best results.
No, that's a great point. Cool. Well, Joe, thank you for coming on the podcast. What's some of the best ways people can connect with you? And I know like are you currently taking on clients now or are you booked up or I
Yeah,
mean, you
yeah,
mentioned you hired somebody. So are you scaling things up a little bit?
yeah. I brought in a retention strategist under me to support a lot of the implementation work, just on this topic, so I could stay strategic.
Yeah.
But yeah, taking on probably about one or two clients right now in the next month or so. So if any of you listening wanna have a chat, we can definitely do that. You can
Awesome.
find me on Twitter or X at ecom Joseph, and then on LinkedIn is Joseph Siegel.
Yeah, we'll have links to your socials in the show notes and stuff too. And yeah, I don't know, for anybody who's listening who's a client of mine, like I've worked with Joe before, so like definitely check him out, and maybe we'll get to collaborate on another client again. That would be cool.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Joe, thanks again for coming on the podcast. For everyone listening at home, this has been another episode of Subscription Prescription. Stay tuned to next Tuesday for another dose. That's it for today. Thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe so that you can get notified when new episodes come out each week on Tuesdays.